Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter's here with me today. Hunter, so glad you're here.
Autumn, it's great to be with you, and this is like the second cool day of fall as we sit here and record this. So my voice is a little scratchy. I'm a little under the weather, both literally and metaphorically. And so why not discuss a novel?
Yeah, it does seem fitting somehow.
Should get a cup of soup and a hot tea and
yeah, we don't have any hot beverages.
And a book.
Yeah. Well, we'll discuss a book. Next time, maybe we'll be prepared better and come with some hot beverages. We had extended a survey question to our listeners in a prior conversation, and we asked if listeners of the podcast would become viewers, i.e. if the podcast were produced and released both in audio format and video format.
I can't wait to hear an update on what the vote tally is.
Well, we received one response to our survey question, and the survey respondent said yes, that this person would watch the podcast, but the survey respondent also extended some other feedback that we hadn't really solicited and voted for no more wardrobe updates.
Oh my gosh. Well, this is why we need to get a proper ballot out there where you can just check a box and there's no room for comments because
Hunter didn't like this unsolicited input.
Well, wardrobe updates are going to die if no one else steps up in support of them. So
that's right.
That's going to happen. And Autumn could be wearing a sweater with leopards leaping across it, and you wouldn't even know. But the video podcast would cure that, and then I would not have to narrate the wardrobe update because it would just be there for everyone to see. So I think that's a fair point. And if you don't like wardrobe updates, then that's probably a good mediating position to take, that it can at least be displayed, even if it can't be talked about.
Sure. Well, we'll extend this survey question into this week. So if you have any input as to whether or not you would like us to produce the podcast in video form as well as audio form, let us know. And
how do they let us know? I think this is the problem. We don't have a clean response or voting mechanism.
You would let us know by emailing podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. And if you have any other input, I say all of the time that we want your suggestions, questions, input, feedback. So, whoever this is clearly listens all the way to the end of the podcast.
That's right. And thank you for listening to the end. That you get to rag on me if you listen to the end of this podcast. That's like a deal I'm willing to make. And those emails go directly to you. You get that email, I believe, in your inbox. And then anything that is a jab at me, Autumn just immediately forwards. It's like if you look at the timestamps, it's like 2 minutes after it comes in, it's in my inbox. She's like, prompt. We have input from a listener.
Yes, a value I have.
Amazing how that happens.
Well, we are beginning our fall book club today, and we decided for this book club. And when I say book club, what I mean is we periodically pick a book, you and I read through it, and then we turn it into some discussions for the podcast. And so in today's episode, we're beginning our fall book club in which we are discussing Silas Marner. And I wanted to ask you first, Hunter, why this book? You and I had discussed a few books and thrown out a few. We decided to discuss a novel this fall. And while you were on sabbatical, I was texting you about our fall book club selection. And this was a book you said you had, I believe, did you read it while you were on sabbatical?
I did read it on sabbatical, yes. And I read it while sitting in a house overlooking the Oregon coast. So
maybe that influenced your decision?
That might have had a lot to do with it too. Got this recommendation from a very literary friend who only recommends good novels. And it was your idea, though, that we should read a novel, because we've typically read nonfiction books, and so I just think of theology or cultural books that I've read and throw one out. So it was your idea. You texted me, said, "Hey, I think we should do a novel. Do you have any ideas?" And I had just finished reading this, and so I said, "I just finished reading this, and I love it, and it's short too, so it's not too long of a book. In fact, I'm reading right now the author's well-known book, Middlemarch. I'm just slowly making my way through it, just a few pages a day, and it's a little bit slower going. Not only is the book longer, and the plot takes longer to unfold, but her writing style, it's written a little bit later than Silas Marner. Her writing style has gotten a little bit more complex, I believe, and so it's not quite as easy of a read. So this, I think, sits in a good place to actually read with friends and talk about.
You said her writing style, but if you look up the book, Silas Marner,
she's a George.
The author is listed as George Eliot, and so tell us a bit about the author.
Well, George Eliot is a pen name. The author is a lady, Mary Ann Evans, and she's from the Victorian era of England. She's an English novelist from the Victorian era, which means, think mid to late 1800s is the Victorian era. And the Victorian era was known for its properness, for its order, for its traditional structure to British society. It was also an era that had an underbelly of sin and corruption, but that tended to sit below the surface and be covered over by the genteelness of the era. I'm thinking about when I read a couple of years ago a lot of Winston Churchill biography. Winston Churchill, although his prime minister work and what he's famous for, which was being prime minister of England during World War II, although that took place after the Victorian era, he was born and raised and grew up in the Victorian era. He was really a product of that era. His whole way of thinking was Victorian, and that he saw the world as ordered and structured a certain way. And he also grew up in an aristocratic society, and the aristocracy in England during the Victorian era was actually pretty corrupt. I mean, there was a lot of spouse swapping, and there were a lot of affairs, and so there was kind of this division between the upper class that were expected to permitted to live a more libertarian life as long as they kind of kept up appearances, and then the lower classes, which were told to live a more normal or conventional kind of morality. And so George Eliot is a product of that era. She is not from the aristocracy per se, but she is upwardly mobile, and part of her life story even is one of upward mobility, and in fact leaving traditional religion and leaving Orthodox Christianity. She scandalized her contemporaries by running off with a married man and living with him for 25 years. Mm-hmm. And then she became a novelist once she was with him. So what is interesting about that historically is she's writing at a time when there's a lot of transition in British society and the English society, and you feel that a little bit in this novel. I don't think that's the main point of the novel. I don't think that's the main value in reading this, but it is an interesting little subplot as we go through it.
It is her departure from so many of the traditions in which she had been raised, from an Orthodox Christianity, from the expectations of Victorian society into this relationship that you mentioned, are interesting in that her novels, Silas Marner among them, are an examination of the sort of moral frameworks of the society at the time she was writing. And you can see in the characters and in the development of the story sort of that wrestling with what structures were actually good for the characters in the story, which in the mind of the author and the reader were permissible for the characters to transgress or to question. And so it's interesting knowing a bit of her story as you read the novel. While it's unwise to read too much of that into it, it's clear that she wrestled with that in her own life, mm-hmm. and that she's working some of that out in the lives of the characters in the novels.
For sure. And you mentioned when we talked about this book that there's this theme both in her life and that flows throughout her books of she kind of broke with convention, especially as it pertains to marriage and relationships and sexuality. And there's this theme that some of the characters do that as well. And they're wrestling with the consequences of that. And I'm sure she wrestled with that as well. So interesting subplot. I found this book fascinating. In fact, I'll just tell our listeners how I found this book. I was spending time with my friends Philip and Rachel Moore in Paris. They're Irish, although they're ministering in Paris, and they're Oxford educated, which means you learn all the good stuff that I don't learn in the University of Arkansas, which is the Oxford of Northwest Arkansas.
Is that what people say?
Yeah, that's what they say. And so Rachel was asking me like, what are your favorite novels? And I was telling her about the novel Jayber Crow, and telling her about the character of Jayber Crow, and encouraging her to read this American novelist, Wendell Berry, who you love as well. And she said, oh, that sounds thematically very similar to Silas Marner. And Silas Marner is one of my favorite novels. I think you would really love it. So I went to the Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris, picked up a copy of this novel, and as soon as I got home, started reading it.
Hunter, you had mentioned that one of the themes that is heavily prevalent in Jayber Crow, and that George Eliot addresses, or Marianne Evans, as her name was, her pen name, as you said, was George Eliot, addresses in Silas Marner, is the theme of vocation. And how did you kind of process that as you were reading Silas Marner? How did you see the theme of vocation taking shape in this book?
I define vocation as having a sense of what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. When I'm called by God, it literally means a calling. What I'm called by God to do and to give myself to in this world. And I've actually just recently been writing a series of articles on vocation. And one of the major factors that shapes vocation is the unwanted dimension of life. It's the stuff that happens to us that we didn't choose. We never would have written into our script. It's not our passion that we're trying to live out. It's something we're given. It's a circumstance we're given. Usually it's some kind of suffering or some kind of struggle or some kind of frustration or loss or grief, and we're given it. And then we're given it, but how we respond to it shapes our life. And so there's not just an issue of like, well, this happened to me and this happened to me, but also, what did you do in response to that? I read a book last month on vocation by Stephen Garber called Visions of Vocation. I actually been wanting to read that book, and then I got a box of books in my office mailed to me from Stephen Garber, and that was one of the books. And I don't even know how he got my address to mail me books or how you knew to mail me books, but thank you. And
he emailed podcast@fellowshipdenver.org.
Yeah, he must have. And he in this book, Visions of Vocation, he tells stories over and over and over again of people having to come to terms with the vocation in light of what is hard or difficult about the world or about the people or about the place that they're called to. And he kind of asks this question over and over again, which is, can you know the world and still love it? Knowing what you know, and knowing for him means you see it realistically, warts and all. You don't have an idealized view. Knowing what you know, what will you do? Will you love the world anyway? So this novel really caused me to think about those kinds of questions, because the main character, Silas Marner, who is the weaver of Raveloe, Silas Marner suffers. He suffers loss several times in the book, and then it traces how he responds. And this is what good fiction can do. It can help us think about how we respond to the things we don't want in our lives.
Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about, I think first let's discuss some of the story itself. We've broken up these conversations into 3 conversations. And to our listeners, we would love your questions. At the end of these 3 episodes, we hope to do a question and response episode based on Silas Marner. So if you're reading along or listening along, to our discussions and send us your questions. So in today's discussion, we're going to cover chapters 1 through 6 of the book, which is the first narrative arc in the story. And we jump in with, like at the very beginning of the book, we were just talking about vocation and a weaver. And George Eliot gives us a depiction of a weaver in their typical place in society, and then begins to shift that focus to the specific central character of this story, who is Silas Marner, and how he, even among this class of weavers who were considered to be a bit odd, a little bit reclusive, he was distinct even among that group of people. So let's get into, I think, some of the what is contained in these first few chapters in the book.
The chapters are structured like this. When the book opens, Silas Marner has been living in Raveloe, and he's the weaver of the town, for 15 years. And it describes the setting. It describes that he's been there for 15 years. Then it briefly goes back in time and describes what he was doing before he got to Raveloe, and then it begins to move forward in time, and the plot unfolds from there. What happens to him after he's been in Raveloe for 15 years. So that's the way it's structured. And I think the first thing to notice is how she describes the town itself. The town is kind of a character, and both in its physical structure and in the people that are part of it. So give us a sample of how she describes the village of Raveloe.
She says, "And Raveloe was a village where many of the old echoes lingered, undrowned by new voices. Not that it was one of those barren parishes lying on the outskirts of civilization, inhabited by meager sheep and thinly scattered shepherds. On the contrary, it lay in the rich central plain of what we are pleased to call Merry England, and held farms which, speaking from a spiritual point of view, paid highly desirable tithes. But it was nestled in a snug, well-wooded hollow, quite an hour's journey on horseback from any turnpike, where it was never reached by the vibrations of the coach horn or of public opinion. It was an important-looking village with a fine old church and large churchyard in the heart of it, and 2 or 3 brick and stone homesteads with well-walled orchards and ornamental weathercocks standing close upon the road and lifting more imposing fronts than the rectory, which peeped from among the trees on the other side of the churchyard."
So it's kind of this island of stability in a world that's changing, but it's in touch with that world, but it's far enough removed that it's stable. It's maybe a place of safety, or at least it's depicted initially that way, a place of safety. We'll come to see if it really is safe, but it's depicted as this place of safety. And you see this theme of like the world is changing around it, but Raveloe is the old way of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she said it hadn't been touched. It was not reached by the vibrations of the coach horn or of public opinion. So in a sense, as you're saying, we get this sense that it's a somewhat idealistic, not perfect, but somewhat idealistic town in the heart of England that hadn't been affected by industrialization yet. So a pre-industrial village where the older ways of life still prevailed.
And then she describes the character like this. It was 15 years since Silas Marner had first come to Raveloe. He was then simply a pallid young man. What is pallid?
I think it means he was pale.
Pale. He's pasty.
Didn't have much color.
He's pasty, yeah. Looks like he's lived through a Midwestern winter. It was 15 years since Silas Marner.
I don't think England is known for its sunshine.
That's right. They're all pasty, yeah. It was 15 years since Silas Marner had first come to Raveloe. He was then simply a pallid young man with prominent, short-sighted brown eyes whose appearance would have had nothing strange for people of average culture and experience. But for the villagers near whom he had come to settle, it had mysterious peculiarities which corresponded with the exceptional nature of his occupation and his advent from an unknown region called Northard. So had his way of life. He invited no comer to step across his door sill, and he never strolled into the village to drink a pint at the Rainbow or to gossip at the wheelwrights. He sought no man or woman save for the purpose of his calling, or in order to supply himself with necessities. And it was soon clear to the Raveloe lasses that he would never urge one of them to accept him against her will, quite as if he had heard them declare that they would never marry a dead man come to life again.
And in this way, I think you said a moment ago, the village of Raveloe becomes almost a character in this introductory section. As the story goes on, we learn more about the people who live in the town, more about Raveloe itself. But in this introductory section, it's definitely set up as the town and Silas Marner. And the two are separate from each other.
That's right.
And Silas Marner doesn't seek out the people in the town, and the town regards him sort of as a whole with some suspicion or some sort of interest, but it's from a distance.
That's right. And he's a recluse. Mm-hmm. So he does interact with the town, but only what pertains to his vocation, which means that only as it pertains to doing the business of a weaver. And he's not interested in ladies. So they're not afraid of him because he's not interested in them. And even his appearance is a little odd. And you mentioned this earlier, his occupation, a weaver, is indoor work done alone, which men typically didn't do indoor work alone. In this culture, they did more outdoor work in groups of men. So even his occupation isolates him and makes him a little bit strange.
As you mentioned before, we're introduced to the town of Raveloe and Silas Marner. And the two are separate, regarding each other with suspicion. The town regards him with curiosity, but they're very much apart from each other. And at this point, as you mentioned before, Hunter, the story takes a turn and we're taken back to what had happened in Silas Marner's life prior to this point, prior to these 15 years in Raveloe. So how does the story unfold then from this point? What is the flashback that we get into Marner's past?
Yeah, before coming to Raveloe, he lived in a town called Lantern Yard, and you get the sense that Lantern Yard is a neighborhood, like an industrial kind of neighborhood of a big city, and the city's not named, but it does represent the part of the world that is changing faster than Raveloe. And maybe it's London, maybe it's Manchester. That was an industrializing city in England. And so in Lantern Yard, he is part of we might call it a fundamentalist religious sect. It's not part of the Church of England, but it's a very strict Calvinistic sect. It could be kind of a derivative of Puritanism. He's part of this religious sect, and this really grounds his life. He's devoted to it, and yet he is essentially betrayed by that community. And the betrayal happens something like this. He is sitting up with one of the deacons who is dying, and so they would sit by his bedside as he was ill. And as he's sitting by the bedside of one of these deacons that's dying, his best friend goes to the church and steals the tithe money and then leaves possession of Silas's, which was a pocket knife that he carried with him everywhere, leaves it at the crime scene to frame him, and kind of even manipulates the religious language to kind of implicate him in this crime. And eventually he's falsely accused, and this crime is pinned on him, and so he's betrayed by this community.
We get the sense in this part of the narrative that his life in Lantern Yard had been in all respects bound up into this religious community. They were, in essence, his family. This was where he had found this friend, developed this friendship. His fiance was a part of this religious community. And the description goes like this. His life before he came to Raveloe had been filled with the movement, the mental activity, and the close fellowship, which in that day, as in this, marked the life of an artisan early incorporated in a narrow religious sect where the poorest layman had the chance of distinguishing himself by gifts of speech and has, at the very least, the weight of a silent vote in the government of his community. Marner was highly thought of in that little hidden world, known to itself as the church assembling in Lantern Yard. He was believed to be a young man of exemplary life and ardent faith. So the depiction here is that Marner had a full life within this community, and when his friend framed him for this crime, and then he protested, and by the casting of lots, the church leaders had determined that he was guilty. And so he felt this betrayal in all ways. It impacted the entirety of his life. And the author doesn't describe then how he came to be in Raveloe, but we're led to understand that this immense rift in his life then caused him to flee Lantern Yard. And so it was in this state that he came to Raveloe and began to live and work there.
And coming to Raveloe is his response to this betrayal. And so here we have this theme of unwanted suffering, unwanted circumstances, and then how do you respond? And part of how he responds is he comes to Raveloe, and then part of how he responds is what he does and kind of the life he makes for himself, what he does and doesn't do, and how he sets up life in Raveloe. And the story picks up from there.
The picture that we get at this point in the story is that Silas Marner is himself reduced by this loss that he has suffered, and he becomes absorbed in his work. So the regularity of his work, the consistency of the weaving, the shuttle moving in his hand, these are the descriptions of what became his tether after he lost his friends and his place of living, his faith even. It is recounted in this part of the story that when he was betrayed, that he also lost his faith. And so weaving is what becomes his tether in this new place. He doesn't know anyone. He doesn't seek out any social interaction. And so he just works day after day after day. And then eventually his work begins to result in financial income. And then the author describes that then a new attachment begins to grow, an attachment to his money that hadn't ever really, it seems, been a motivation for him or a central part of his life before this.
And listen to how it describes him throwing himself into his work. She says his first movement after the shock had been to work in his loom, and he went on with this unremittingly, never asking himself why now he was come to Raveloe. He worked far on into the night to finish the tale of Miss Osgood's table linen sooner than she expected, without contemplating beforehand the money she would put in his hand for the work. He seemed to weave like the spider from pure impulse without reflection. And so he works really hard. But to your point, he works really hard. He starts to make money. Because he doesn't have social connections, he doesn't really have anything to do with the money. And so he begins to store it up, and he becomes not just a recluse, but a reclusive miser. And he is depicted then as taking delight in his money. There's a great passage at the end of chapter 2, which describes how he would every night survey his stockpile of gold and silver and coins, and that was really what became the love of his life. It reads like this: "But at night came his revelry. At night he closed his shutters and made fast his doors and drew forth his gold. Long ago the heap of coins had become too large for the iron pot to hold them, and he had made for them two thick leather bags, which wasted no room in their resting place, but lent themselves flexibility to every corner. How the guineas shone as they came pouring out of the dark leather mouths. The silver bore no large proportion in amount to the gold, because the long pieces of linen which formed his chief work were always partly paid for in gold, and out of the silver he supplied his own bodily wants." So he spent the silver and he saved the gold, and the gold is piling up. choosing always the shilling and sixpence to spend in this way. He loved the guinea best, but he would not change the silver, the crowns, and the half-crowns that were his own earnings, begotten by his labor. He loved them all. He spread them out in heaps and bathed his hands in them, and then he counted them and set them up in regular piles and felt their rounded outline between his thumb and fingers, and thought fondly of the guineas that were only half earned by the work in his loom, as if they had been unborn children.
Mm. Not only is this depiction one that the language used there is that he began to have this intimate feeling that was directed towards his gold, towards the coins themselves, and he appreciated the ritual of stacking them up and counting them and feeling them. And it seems as if in this portion of the story that George Eliot is giving us a sense that Silas Marner began to substitute his gold for human connection. Mm-hmm. And the gold was predictable. Its feel and weight in his hand was unchanging. It was safe. And he began to extend whatever love he had in his soul towards his gold. So in his withdrawal from social life, now this was becoming the substitute for human interaction. And it was safe and couldn't betray him.
It's also his substitute God. He has left his religion behind in Lantern Yard, and this is what he worships now. And so you get this picture of like the human heart longs to connect with something outside of itself, something great, something that provides beauty and stability and safety. And he finds it in this stockpile of guineas. I love that. I guess a guinea is a coin, a gold coin.
Yeah.
And so, he's fondling the guineas.
And then the story shifts. After this depiction, this image of Marner absorbed in his work and in his money, then the story shifts back to Raveloe, and we're introduced to some of the people who live in the town. And in its initial depiction, Raveloe seemed to be a fairly, as we said, somewhat idealistic English town. And now we begin to be, as we're introduced to the characters, you get a peek beneath the surface. And so Raveloe, rather than being a character itself, now becomes a town inhabited by these various characters. And so in the next chapter, George Eliot introduces us to the Cass family. The Cass family were the wealthiest household in Raveloe, and Squire Cass is a seemingly sort of complacent, also indulgent father, and he has two sons. The older son, Godfrey, is at least at first glance, an upstanding citizen, sort of the representation of the family that father would hope for. But later we find out, later in this chapter, we're given a glimpse into Godfrey's life. He had also had made some poor decisions, had some lapses in judgment, and we find out later that he is secretly married to a woman who is an opium addict. But his father doesn't know this, and so he has managed to hide this attachment from most of the people in his life, most of the people in the town, and so he has also managed to preserve his social standing. But his life is complicated because he has fallen in love with a woman in the town named Nancy Lammeter, and he is unable to act on his affection for her, his feelings for her, because he is already married to another woman. And his younger brother, who is an opposite sort of character to that of Godfrey, a frivolous younger brother who has made many bad decisions but doesn't make any pains to hide them, doesn't really care about his social standing. Dunstan, he's irresponsible and manipulative. And so we're now introduced to the Cass family because as the story goes, their lives will intersect with Silas Marner's in a very distinct way. Mm-hmm. So we find out that Dunstan, the younger brother, knows Godfrey's secret and is holding it over him.
Over his head. And the drama between these two brothers is going to somehow spill over and affect Silas Marner. So again, we've got this theme of something's going to happen to him that he doesn't choose, and it's because of this family drama Godfrey Cass has hidden his wife in another town, so she doesn't live there in this town. He's carrying on this courtship of Nancy, and his brother knows about this, kind of has this knowledge on him, and does what brothers do, which is you use that against your brother if you've got the dirt on him, right? And what happens that the Cass family's kind of subtle internal drama spills over and affects Silas.
Mm-hmm. And so Dunstan convinces Godfrey to let him sell his prized possession, a beautiful horse named Wildfire. Presumably they have some debts. Godfrey has some debts that need to be addressed. Dunstan concocts a scheme and convinces Godfrey to let him take his horse. And then in this portion of the story, through a reckless accident, Dunstan, instead of selling the horse, ends up killing the horse. And
Dunstan,
yes, who is also referred to as Dunsey.
Dunsey. Okay, yes.
in the book. And
he is Dunsey, yes.
Before this tragic accident, on his way out of town to sell the horse, we're given a glimpse into what Dunstan is processing. So it sounds as if the people in the town have for a while had a suspicion that Silas Marner is hoarding money and has built up a small fortune. And the people in the town talk about it. It's not really known. It's just gossip. But Dunstan, as he's riding past Silas Marner's house, is contemplating this and thinks perhaps Godfrey should simply ask to borrow some money from Silas Marner if he really has all this money. And so maybe I should return home, return Wildfire, and give Godfrey this suggestion instead. But he likes having this leverage over his brother, and he doesn't want to give him the satisfaction of paying off his debts and keeping Wildfire. So he proceeds on, ends up killing this beautiful horse, and then on his way home, this realization, again, as he's passing Silas Marner's house, strikes him that maybe there really is something to this town gossip. Maybe Silas Marner really does have a stockpile of gold that he has managed to save.
And he goes into his house when he's not there, and he discovers Silas Marner's gold, and he takes it. And so then Silas comes home. Now we get to chapter 5. Silas comes home and discovers that this love of his life is now gone.
For the second time.
So he suffered a second sense of betrayal, or a second tragedy, you might say. And he discovers that his money is gone. And now he asks that critical question, what's he going to do? How's he going to respond? And how does he respond this time?
This time he comes, well, first he's distraught and disbelieving and frantically searches his house. He has poor eyesight because of years spent over looking closely at his loom, hunched towards his loom. And so in his sort of foggy vision, he searches and searches his house frantically, can't believe that his gold is gone. And then finally it settles on his mind that it really is gone. And
it's probably a thief. He's kind of pondering, like, is this stolen? Could this be stolen?
First he wonders if it's God, if it's some sort of retribution, divine retribution. And is his money simply being taken again by a cruel divinity? But then it enters his mind, as you're saying, that perhaps it was a thief. And so he is faced with a critical decision as to how to handle it, as you said, Hunter. And he has to decide, is he going to reach out to the people in the town and to trust them, first of all, with the knowledge of the money that he loved, that was precious to him, that he had saved up and now is gone. So it's a very vulnerable moment for Silas in the story.
And he decides to go to where he knows the men of the town gather, and to announce that he has suffered this theft. And that place is called the Rainbow. It's a pub. And he's never been to the Rainbow. In fact, he's described like this at the end of chapter 5. The Rainbow, in Marner's view, was a place of luxurious resort for rich and stout husbands, whose wives had superfluous stores of linen, It was the place where he was likely to find the powers and dignities of Raveloe, and where he could most speedily make his loss public. So this is a world, he's now literally entering a world he doesn't know, but he's been living in close proximity to for 15 years. And he's going to announce that he has suffered this theft, and he's going to ask for help. And that's a big turning point in the novel, and that's where we'll pick up the story next week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hunter, you mentioned one of the primary themes in the book already, this question of vocation, but not only the question of vocation, but how vocation, our understanding of vocation, is shaped by difficult circumstances or suffering or the things that happen to us. And we've mentioned a couple of times in our conversation today, there were now, at this point in our discussion, 2 tragic losses that Silas Marner had suffered. The first being the loss of really his entire life, the community that he had grown in, the community that loved him, his friend, his fiance, his spiritual leaders, the trust that they had in him. And when he went to Raveloe, he went to a place where no one knew him, which was both, in a sense, a grace and caused much grief. And so you said part of this examination is part of what we can examine through the story is Silas's response and then our own response in moments like this, when something happens in a life that maybe is tragic, maybe a sort of suffering, something that happens not of our own making, and in a sense, we would say happens to us. Mm-hmm. And then there's this examination of how do we respond?
Yes. And there's also this trend of he finally, when he goes to the Rainbow to try asking for help, it's like he's finally come to the end of himself. And so there's this theme that often our first response to a tragedy or to suffering doesn't work. And for him, it actually, his first response, which is to run away to Raveloe and to kind of live on the edges of society and to not let himself get too close to the people around him because he don't want to get hurt again, and to take pleasure and safety in his money, that does work for 15 years. And then it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, when it collapses on him, that's the point that he finally has to come to the end of himself and decide that he's going to go try to connect with these people who he's never had to connect with before.
It's interesting, too. There's sort of a sub-theme woven in with this theme that we're discussing. That is that Silas experiences that there's not truly safety in either of these environments. So in the first betrayal, Silas was in the church, presumably a place of safety, and a place where he was known and appreciated, even is the picture that we're given. But ultimately, that didn't end up being a place of safety for him. And then he goes to Raveloe, which, as we said, seems to represent an ideal English village. But as we begin to come into contact through the story with the characters who live in Raveloe, we realize that their lives are imperfect too, and that really the people themselves in this English town, that it isn't a place of safety either, even though it's untouched by some of the changes that came about through industrialization. Even so, that the characters there were experiencing a sort of suffering, circumstances that had either been brought on themselves or happened again to them. And so there wasn't safety really in Raveloe, and then there wasn't safety in Silas's stand-in God and the idol of the gold that he constructed.
Yeah, the fall has touched everything, and it's perhaps touched Raveloe more subtly because Raveloe has a traditional veneer, and it has this patriarchal family, the Cass family, who seems to be this fine, upstanding family, but underneath the surface of kind of their gentility, underneath the surface, they themselves are wrestling powerfully with sin and with corruption and with desires and impulses they can't control. And so there's this picture that there's really nowhere in the world that's totally safe. There's not a place you can go where you're going to be guaranteed for sure that the serpent will not enter in and eat away at and destroy what is there. And so the novel seems to kind of have this question like, where can we go if nowhere in the world is totally predictably safe? And I actually think that's something a lot of people have to wrestle with. And in fact, I appreciate this novel in the sense that there's a lot of people in our world who would say they've had a frustrating or a bad experience with religion or with a church community, and they feel betrayed by it. And yet this novel is warning us like, well, that may be true, and the place you go to may end up being just as corrupt as the place you left. And so where can you go?
All right, what's a good...
Well,
I think
we say, well, that's, hey, that, yeah. I think you could just say like, hey, those are kind of some of the unresolved questions that the book kind of sets us up for. And maybe next week we'll talk about what happens when Silas goes public, and gets reconnected, kind of bring it back to the story,
Okay.
Yeah, bring it back to the story.
Okay. There are some echoes of Ecclesiastes in what you're describing there, yes. Hunter, in the various places that Silas had turned to for grounding, for safety. Each one of those, one by one, systematically in the story, lets him down. He doesn't find safety or fulfillment or purpose, ultimately, in any of the various things, in the people who betrayed him, in his work, in and of itself. Although it acts as a tether, it can't ultimately provide him purpose or safety or fulfillment in the gold. So I hear, as you're describing that, there's some echoes of all the vanities, the various vanities that the teacher in Ecclesiastes examines. And then Jesus' own warning that if we put our trust in earthly treasures, then we're putting our trust in something that can be stolen. When he says, where thieves break through,
break in and steal. Yeah. And that's what happens here. And so there is a playing out of Jesus' warning. And there's this question that kind of hangs over the book from this point forward of where can he go and what can he do?
Well, that's where we'll pick up our conversation next week.
All right.
So to those of you listening, now we've mentioned this a couple of times. I think the email got more mentions in today's podcast than it typically does. But to those of you listening, we do love hearing from you. And you can send us anything, even unsolicited opinions and advice, and I will be sure to forward them straight away to Hunter. But send your suggestions, your questions about Silas Marner or about today's episode, or send us articles, books that you're interested in that you think would make for good conversation on the podcast. You can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.